Hey guys, tonight we travel deep into the heart of Bavaria, where the cold wind sweeps over forgotten hills and frost clings to the eaves of a lonely farmhouse. Picture this. Snow drapes the earth in silence, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the soft creak of wood settling in the bitter night. A chimney smokes though no one's seen its owners in days, and footprints half covered by snow lead to the barn, but none ever return. Now dim, the lights maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The forest pressed close in these parts, pine branches heavy with snow that sighed under its own weight. The farm lay far from the village of Gröbern, cloaked in isolation and winter's hush. Hinterkaifeck, it wasn't marked on any new maps, just a name old people still whispered when they spoke of things best left forgotten. The family who lived there, Andreas Gruber, his wife, Cecilia, their widowed daughter, Victoria, her 2 children, and the maid kept to themselves. They were not poor, not rich, just distant. Even in church they'd sit apart. The neighbors claimed Andreas was a hard man, perhaps cruel. Victoria sang beautifully, though she hadn't performed in the choir since her husband died in the war. And no one ever heard the little ones cry. On the last day anyone saw the family alive, it had snowed in great lazy flakes. Victoria had come into town, her face pale and lips dry to buy feed. She spoke, little eyes darting hands tucked tightly into her coat sleeves. She paid with coins still warm from her palm. The grocer's wife would later remember that tremble. Something wasn't right, she thought, but no one asked. Back at the farm, a crow sat on the fence post silent and watching. The snowstorm rolled in fast that night. The barn, looming large and dark beside the house, creaked with wind and age. Somewhere in its loft, a single lantern burned, swinging softly, its glow pulsing against the frost-glazed window like a slow heartbeat. No one should have been in the barn at that hour. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, had only arrived that morning. Her letter of hire had been strange, sent weeks after the last maid had left without warning, claiming the place was cursed. Still, Maria needed the work. Her brother had brought her by sled, and as he left, she lingered in the doorway. The wind pulled at her scarf, and the forest seemed to shift behind her. That night, Maria lay in the small servants' room, the walls thin, the stove cold. She could hear the house breathe timbers groaning softly, pipes clicking, and something else. A muffled crunching outside. At first she thought it was snow sliding from the roof. But it came again. Closer. Deliberate. She held her breath. Footsteps. In the morning, the chimney still smoked. But no one answered when the mailman knocked. The cattle lowed anxiously, and the barn door ajar swayed slightly in the wind. For the next few days, townsfolk assumed the Grubers were simply weathering the storm. It wasn't unusual. Their paths had often been their own. But something itched at the back of the villagers' minds. A quiet unease. The farm had never quite felt right. A week passed before anyone went to check. When they arrived, the snow had crusted over, hardened like old wax. The barn was oddly silent, the animals hungry and shivering. Inside, hay still scattered on the ground, fresh, despite the days past. But there, under a loose plank, something dark and frozen jutted from the straw. The bodies lay stacked as though tucked in by a careful hand. Andreas, first, then Cecilia, then Victoria. Her arms twisted unnaturally, her face half covered in hay. The girl's eyes were open. Inside the house, the children were dead in their beds. The maid, too, still in her nightgown, a smear of blood down one wall, like a fingerprint dragged to silence. Nothing had been stolen, nothing broken. But upstairs in the attic, They found the oddest thing of all, a small indentation in the dust where someone had lain. Bread crusts. An oil lantern burned low. Someone had lived there watching. Later, the villagers would remember strange things from the weeks before. Keys missing. Footsteps in the attic when no one was home. The family dog, once fierce, had grown quiet. Someone had been watching them. Even now, the wind carries whispers through the pine trees near Hinterkaifeck. The house was torn down, but nothing built in its place. The land stays bare. They say, if you pass by on a snowy night, you'll see a light flicker from where the barn once stood. And if you listen closely, you might hear the sound of footsteps crunching across untouched snow, with no one in sight. The investigation that followed was slow-heavy, like the snowfall that never seemed to stop that April. Police from Munich arrived in their thick wool coats, brushing frost from their mustaches, boots crunching over the same snow that had swallowed the killer's trail. Nothing led in. Nothing led out. Just the scattered footprints around the barn, some overlapping as if someone had circled the house for hours. Inside, it was as if life had simply paused. A pot of porridge sat on the stove, half-eaten. Bread had been cut neatly and left on a plate by the window. In the corner, the sewing basket sat open a needle halfway through a button. These were not the remnants of a frantic struggle. No one had run. No one had screamed. The autopsies revealed something else. The wounds had been precise, controlled. Whoever had killed the family had done so with something heavy and sharp, likely a mattock. The blows were clean, but not rushed, not fueled by rage. Something colder, more unnerving. The family hadn't all died at once. The daughter, little Kazelia, had been alive after the initial attack. They found clumps of her own hair in her hand. She'd torn it out, waiting for death to return. And yet, despite all this horror, nothing was stolen. In fact, some things had been maintained. The cows had been fed. The dog fed too. The chimney still smoked. The house alive, even as its family was not. A theory formed, one that would haunt the investigators. The killer had remained on the farm, slept in the house, lived among the bodies for days, maybe longer. The attic bedding confirmed it. Dust disturbed by heavy boots. The attic window had frost melt, where someone had breathed against the glass, watching the road, watching the world go on without them. But who? Andreas Gruber had made enemies, there was no doubt. Stern and unyielding, he had once struck a neighbor for trespassing, and more than one villager whispered of his hand being too heavy with his own daughter Victoria. Some even claimed she'd gone to the priest, begged for protection. But no one listened. Not then. The previous maid's testimony resurfaced, a letter she had sent weeks before quitting. "There are voices in the attic," she wrote. "When I wake, there's hay on the floor, even though I swept it clean. Herr Gruber says I'm imagining things, but I know someone's watching me." The letter had been dismissed at the time, but now it read like a prophecy. The townspeople speculated wildly. A vagrant, a soldier gone mad. Victoria's dead husband returned after the war with a broken mind and a heavier hand. Yet no one saw anything. No one came forward. And then there was the legend. The older folk spoke of something older than war, older than men. A presence in the woods. The Old One. In winter, when the earth was silent and the snow muffled prayers, it wandered. They say you shouldn't build too close to the forest's edge. The priest refused to step into the house. He stood at the threshold, lips pale, murmuring a prayer half forgotten. When asked what he felt, he simply replied, "It's not empty." The town buried the family, but not in the same place. Victoria and her children were laid to rest near the church, Andreas and his wife in a separate, unmarked grave. The house sat still for weeks afterward. boarded and dark. Yet smoke continued to curl from the chimney. They sent men again. Nothing. Just ash in the fireplace and a single boot print wet in the hallway. The doors had been locked from the inside. Rumors took root like frostbite, slow spreading, impossible to ignore. Children dared each other to run up to the house at dusk, knock 3 times and run. But one boy never returned. He was found at dawn just outside the barn, frostbitten and silent. His eyes would never quite focus again. He never spoke of what he saw. The townspeople eventually razed the house, burned the barn, let the fields grow wild. But some nights when the wind is right, you can still hear the barn door creak, the cowbells clink, the attic window rattle, and always that steady crunch of footsteps in snow. Long after the fire had reduced the house to ash and the barn to embers, Hinterkaifeck remained a scar on the land, a place where birds no longer nested and deer gave a wide berth. Yet nature never fully reclaimed it. The grass refused to grow over the blackened soil where the house once stood. The well ran dry, though nearby springs flowed freely. Even the snow settled differently there, crusting unevenly, as if uncertain whether it should stay. But memory is a stubborn thing, especially in villages like Grubern, where every crooked fence and withered tree has a story attached to it. The old men at the tavern still spoke of the case. Over schnapps and candlelight, they would lean close and whisper theories, not because they hoped for answers, but because they feared silence more. One theory, spoken only after the 4th drink, was that it had never been a person who killed the Grubers. Not exactly. There are things in the woods one would murmur that don't fear men, things that watch. According to an old hunter, long dead, now a pale figure had been seen weeks before the murder standing motionless at the tree line near the property. Too tall, unblinking, gone in the time it took to say a prayer. He never hunted near Hinterkaifeck again. Another villager, a shepherd, claimed to have seen smoke from the house after it was abandoned, but it was the wrong color. Not wood smoke, he said. Grayish green, like rot, like sickness. He left town soon after, but legends like the fog often settle in deep. The case files, yellowed and brittle, now remain unsolved, stamped and re-stamped with the words, Keine heiße Spur. No hot lead, no conviction. Over 100 people were questioned, handwriting analyzed, soldiers tracked, every distant cousin and forgotten friend summoned from their quiet lives to answer for a murder so clean, so methodical, it left no trace but horror. And yet something did change quietly, imperceptibly, in those who came close to the case. Inspector Georg Reingruber, one of the first to walk the site, developed a tremor in his right hand. It began days after the visit and worsened rapidly. He couldn't write by the month's end. His wife said he began sleepwalking, always heading toward the fireplace. They moved to Munich. He retired early, drank heavily, refused to speak of the case ever again. Another officer, young at the time and eager, claimed he saw a shape in the attic, a flash of something pale, and crouched just as his lantern flickered. He thought it was a trick of the light until that night when he dreamt of the attic again. In the dream, he was the one crouching, watching. He stopped sleeping altogether. Not long after villagers began placing talismans around their homes, scratched symbols into their door frames, hung horseshoes above their barns, sprinkled salt along the thresholds. These weren't Christian protections. They were older. They were afraid. It wasn't just the murders. It was the quiet afterward, the feeling that something remained, something unbothered by fire or fences. One family, the Renzis, attempted to build a new cottage near the edge of the property, hoping to reclaim the land. They lasted one winter. Their young daughter began waking each night, crying, pointing to the attic that wasn't there. "He's still upstairs," she whispered. He forgot to leave. The father, skeptical, checked every inch of the home. Nothing. but the floorboards creaked where they shouldn't. Ash appeared in the hearth every morning, though no one had used it. On the final night, the mother awoke to find her daughter sitting by the window, humming a lullaby in a language she didn't recognize. When she asked where she had learned it, the girl replied, "The lady with the braid sang it. She's cold. She wants inside." They left before dawn, never returned, and so Hinterkaifeck settled back into the forest like a wound scabbed over, but never healed. Still, the wind there never quite whistles. It hums, soft like a lullaby just beneath the edge of hearing, and travelers who stray too close to the overgrown path report a strange stillness, as if the trees lean inward, listening, as if the snow waits. Sometimes people still find footprints near the clearing, bare feet, no others nearby, as if someone has been walking in circles, waiting to be noticed. Winter faded as it always did, but Hinterkaifeck remained unchanged. Time seemed reluctant to touch it. The trees didn't grow thicker, the weeds didn't reclaim the soil, and when spring arrived, it passed over the land like a breath held too long. It was around this time that a local schoolteacher, Herr Brame, began writing about the murders. He was a quiet man, childless and fond of folklore. In his free hours, he had collected ghost stories and rural superstitions, and the Gruber case fascinated him, not because of its horror, but because of its stillness. Most crimes leave a mess, he wrote in his journal. But this one, it feels tidy. Too tidy. As if someone finished a task they had practiced many times before. Or something. Something that follows rules we don't understand. Brame visited the clearing twice that spring. The first time he found nothing. Just the hush of birds too far away, and the strange way his own footsteps seemed muted. The second time, he brought with him a small bundle of rosemary and a cross carved from rowan wood, old protections passed down from his grandmother. Not because he believed, but because he didn't want to be foolish. He sat near where the barn had once stood, notebook in hand, and began to write. Descriptions, observations, a sense of weight in the air. The sky was cloudless, yet the sun refused to warm his skin. And then he noticed the silence, not the kind that happens when the wind pauses or birds fall quiet. This silence was deeper, dense, as though sound itself had been pressed out of the world around him. He realized he could hear his own pulse. That's when he heard the breath, not his own. It came from behind, close, deliberate. The exhale of lungs that had waited patiently. He turned. Nothing. Not a rabbit. Not a twig snapping. Just empty, snow-bleached grass and the trees unmoving. He left in haste, though later he could not recall the path he took. His notes from that day ended abruptly mid-sentence. There is something old here. Not dead. Not living. Waiting. He never returned. The townspeople had grown accustomed to avoiding the place. Even maps stopped naming it. No one plotted its coordinates. But it lingered in dreams. One woman, Anna, who lived on the far edge of the neighboring village, began sleepwalking after visiting her cousin in Groburn. At first, her husband found her in the hallway, then at the edge of the yard. Then one night, she disappeared. When they found her half-frozen barefoot and silent, she stood in the very center of the Hinterkaifeck clearing. Her hands were muddy fingers worn to the bone, as if she had been digging. But no hole was found, just scratch marks on the ground. Circular, endless. She was taken to the hospital, where she remained wordless for weeks. The only thing she ever said came late one night when a nurse found her sitting upright, eyes wide, staring at nothing. He was under the straw, Anna whispered. He was always there. He never left. The nurse quit the next day. There were no more attempts to rebuild. No more stories in the papers. But word spread quietly, like rot through old wood. Travelers detoured. Families taught their children not to speak the name. And yet, It was said if you whispered Hinterkaifeck in the dark, the wind would stop to listen. Some believe it was never a man, that it had only worn a man's shape, that it came through the attic window with the snow, and that it was drawn not to blood, but to silence, that it waits for houses to grow still, that it waits for rooms with no prayers. It's not uncommon even now for certain villages in Bavaria to leave a single candle burning in their barns during the last nights of winter. A superstition, they say, for luck. But the old ones know better. They say the light keeps things away, things that are used to watching in the dark. In the years that followed, Hinterkaifeck passed out of headlines and into folklore. The official documents were boxed, sealed, and buried in government archives. But in places like Groburn, no tragedy ever dies, only shift shape settles deeper, becomes something you whisper to your children when the wind howls through the shutters. There were still those who came looking, the curious, the skeptics, the ones with tape recorders and notepads shivering in boots too new for forest paths. In 1963, a man named Kostler arrived from the city. He called himself a folklorist, though he carried more cameras than books. He stayed at the edge of the village, renting a spare room from a retired widow who hadn't said the name Hinterkaifeck in over 2 decades. She refused to give directions, simply telling him, "If you're meant to find it, you will." He did. The next morning, he left early, following a path not marked on any modern map. Locals watched him disappear past the tree line with a thermos, a canvas satchel, and too much confidence. He didn't return that night, or the next. On the 3rd day, his landlady alerted the police. They found him near the center of the clearing, crouched beside a burned-out camp stove. He was alive, barely. Hypothermic, silent eyes, red with burst vessels, and hands clawed tight around a cracked camera. It had no film inside. When asked what happened, he said only, "I found the attic." He died 6 months later, in a facility near Regensburg. Scribbled across the walls of his final hospital room were the same 4 words, written over and over in slanted, desperate ink. Someone was still there. Years passed. New wars came and went. Generations rose and fell. Yet even among the youth stories lingered, passed down like old charms. A girl named Ilse, 17 and stubborn, dared to camp at the clearing one summer with 2 friends. Armed with flashlights and bravado, they pitched a tent where the barn once stood. The night was warm. Too warm, some said, and oddly silent. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. Ilse's friends awoke screaming just after 3 a.m. The tent had been unzipped from the outside. Ilse was gone. They found her near dawn, sitting cross-legged in the grass with her eyes closed, lips moving as if in prayer. She couldn't recall how she had left the tent or what she had seen, but there was mud beneath her nails and a small bundle of hay in her hand. Later, she began drawing barns, over and over, always from the same angle, looking up at them from beneath the floorboards. No one could explain how she knew the layout. The barn had been gone decades before she was born. Some say the land itself holds memory, that places steeped in grief learn to echo. But Hinterkaifeck doesn't echo. It listens. There are stories, modern ones, of drivers who take wrong turns on winter nights. Their GPS loses signal. The road narrows. Trees thicken. The headlights catch the shimmer of snow swirling in tight spirals. And just before the car stalls, they see it, a figure in the distance, standing still, not threatening, not moving, just watching. The engines always start again. The road always appears behind them. But none of those who return can quite describe the figure, only that it didn't blink, and that somehow they felt known. In Munich, an archivist named Lenz came across the Gruber case files by accident, misfiled under agricultural incidents. Curious, he took them home. Within a week, he had withdrawn from work. Neighbors reported a smell from his flat. When authorities entered, they found pages pinned to the walls. copies of autopsy reports, photographs of the attic dust, and crude sketches of an emaciated face with black eyes and a split mouth. One page bore a single sentence written in blood-red ink. "The silence is a door." No further clues were found. Lenz was never seen again. Even now, Hinterkaifeck has no official marker. No plaque, no road sign. But locals still glance toward the forest when the wind shifts. Still light candles. Still keep their barns warm through the last frost. Because the cold carries memory. Because hay still stirs when no one's in the loft. Because somewhere between footsteps in snow and attic beams groaning under weight, not seen something patient, waits. Autumn came gently to Bavaria that year, the trees shedding their gold and copper coats like secrets. The hills rolled soft beneath low clouds, and villagers busied themselves with harvests, firewood, and the slow retreat of warmth. But even in the quiet rhythm of the season, some spoke in hushed tones of Hinterkaifeck, though only after dark, and only when the doors were bolted shut. A new priest had come to the region, Father Matthias Young, and modern, full of fire and reason. He believed in clearing old shadows. He called superstition the enemy of faith. And so when told of the cursed land and the strange deaths, he did not flinch. He asked to see the place for himself. An old farmer offered to take him, though his hands trembled on the reins. They traveled by cart at dawn, mist curling around them like fingers from the ground. The forest grew denser the closer they came, and by the time the wheels groaned to a stop, even Father Matthias felt the stillness. Nothing stirred in the trees. The field lay barren and dry, though recent rains had turned other parts of the valley lush. Father Matthias stepped out and made the sign of the cross over the clearing. Then he began to pray. The farmer kept to the cart. Later, the priest returned pale and silent. His collar was torn and his hands were scratched, as if from brambles, though there were no bushes. He didn't speak on the ride back, and when the farmer asked if he was well, Father Matthias replied, "He listens when you call him, but you must not call him by name." He resigned from the parish within a month, moved to southern Italy, took a vow of silence. That same winter, a university professor named Kohler published a paper arguing that the Hinterkaifeck murders were likely part of an obscure rural cult ritual, long suppressed by the church. He cited unusual arrangements of straw iconography found carved beneath the floorboards of similar farms across Bavaria, and records of disappearances linked to the darkest days of winter. The paper was dismissed by academics, but within weeks, Kohler received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph, grainy, faded. It showed the Hinterkaifeck barn, its loft window just visible, and in that window, a face. Not clear, not fully human. He never published again. Some believe the true horror of Hinterkaifeck lies not in the blood that was spilled, but in the door that was opened. Something entered, or perhaps was let in, and once inside, it did not leave. Legends sprang up among children. They told of a man with no tongue who lives in attics, whispering through walls and feeding on silence. If you hear him breathing while you sleep, you must not move. If you see footprints in your hallway and no door is open, you must salt the threshold before midnight. And if you ever dream of snow falling inside your house, you must wake at once because he's standing over you. These stories were told with laughter, of course, until one boy, Felix, age 9, vanished from his bed one January night. The window was locked. The door bolted from the inside, but on the floor beneath his sheets were hay strands and a single bloody handprint too long to be a child's. They never found him. A week later, Felix's younger sister told her teacher that the quiet man in the attic had come to take him because he was too loud in his sleep. She smiled when she said it. By spring, the family had moved. The villagers grew more superstitious. They nailed iron spikes into their roof beams. They burned sage and lavender. And some, quietly without fanfare, began placing old farm tools dulled and rusted beneath their floorboards. Not for protection, but for offering. It said, "The thing that lives where the Grubers died has rules. It doesn't like noise. It despises light. It feeds on fear, yes, but it thrives in silence. In families who bury secrets. In homes where the attic is never checked. It watches, learns, waits. It wears skin when it must. It walks like us, breathes like us, until it doesn't. And if the snow falls early that year, if the cows begin to stir at night, if you hear footsteps above your room when everyone else is asleep, don't go looking. Winter returned early the next year, without warning, without mercy. It crept in overnight, cloaking the hills in white and silencing the world beneath a dense, soundless frost. Trees groaned under the weight of snow, too heavy for autumn branches. Hearths burned day and night, and yet still the cold seeped through cracks in old wood and older memories. That's when the dreams began, not just for one, but for many. In Groburn, 5 villagers, all living on the outskirts, near the old road that once led to Hinterkaifeck, reported similar nightmares. Each described standing in a dark barn, the smell of wet hay choking the air. A single lantern flickered from above, revealing nothing but the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, impossibly close. One man awoke to find hay in his bed. Another, an older woman, discovered claw-like scratches inside her attic door, though she hadn't opened it in years. A child, a boy of 6, screamed every night at precisely 3:15 a.m., always waking with the same words, "He's coming down the ladder." None had spoken of their dreams to each other beforehand. The priest, long since replaced after Father Matthias fled, called for a blessing of the land. A dozen villagers followed him to the edge of the woods, though none dared step onto the actual clearing. The ceremony was simple: salt scattered, prayers mumbled, crosses carved into the bark of nearby trees. But the woods didn't stir. The air hung heavy, unmoved, and the wind that had carried their chance away just moments before stopped. One of the younger men, Stefan, scoffed at the ritual. "Ghost stories," he muttered, brushing snow from his sleeves. "There's nothing here but old wood and older wives' tales." He went missing that night. When they found his body days later, it was in his own barn, alone, cold, curled in the fetal position beneath a pile of hay that hadn't been there the night before. There were no signs of violence, no wounds, just a look of absolute terror frozen on his face and his mouth filled with straw. That was the last time the blessing was attempted. Instead, the villagers turned to older customs. They painted white chalk symbols over their door frames, hung rusty keys above cradles, poured milk onto the earth at dusk, quiet offerings to quiet things. Because Hinterkaifeck wasn't just a place anymore, it was a presence. The university archives began receiving anonymous letters, each with shaky handwriting, none signed, all referencing the case in cryptic, unsettling ways. One simply read, "I lived in the loft. He lived beneath it." Another, "He fed the cows so they wouldn't notice the smell." And a third sent weeks later contained only a photo, a grainy, out-of-focus image of what seemed to be an attic crawl space, and in the shadows, a smile, thin, too wide, without eyes. The archivist who opened the letter never returned to work. Her resignation note was a single sentence scribbled in blue ink, "I hear him on the roof." And yet the land remains, unfenced, untouched, but not empty. Every few winters, a hiker goes missing in the woods nearby. Every now and then, a child speaks of a man in the rafters, a pale hand on the edge of the bed, a lullaby hummed in a voice that's too deep to be loving, too slow to be human, but always soft, always so very soft. And sometimes the snow on the clearing falls in circles, as if something walks there, in loops, waiting for footsteps to follow. By the time the 1980s arrived, bringing electric heat, brighter roads, and satellite dishes, many assumed the darkness of Hinterkaifeck had faded into the folds of folklore. After all, who believes in haunted barns when televisions hum in every room and news travels faster than fear? But the silence remained, and so did the footprints. In 1986, two backpackers from Hamburg, students on a winter trek through rural Bavaria, disappeared for 3 days. They had no connection to the Gruber story, no knowledge of the land's weight. Their plan was to follow a trail into the lower forest camp overnight, then continue on to the next village. They returned pale, ragged, frostbitten. They refused to speak of where they had been. One, Lars, would later be institutionalized after attempting to burn his own attic, muttering, "It followed me home. It knows the smell of my bed." The other, Jana, withdrew completely. In her final interview with police, she said only, "He sleeps between the floors." A local woodcutter later confirmed finding the remains of a smothered campfire not far from the Hinterkaifeck site, surrounded by disturbed snow, like something had moved in restless spirals around it. But no footprints led in or out. The authorities labeled it hysteria. But the villagers knew better. That same winter, a snowstorm cut the village off for 4 days. Power flickered. Roads vanished beneath drifts as high as fences. In that silence, doors creaked that shouldn't have. Attics groaned under invisible weight. One family, the Ebners, reported scratching in their walls. Then the voice came, whispered, rhythmic, always from the vents. It said simply, "You forgot to lock the hayloft." They didn't own a barn. They moved in the spring. By then, even the younger generation had adopted the rituals. Doors were never left ajar past sundown. Attics were blessed each new moon. Children were taught never to whistle indoors, lest something whistle back. At the local school, a new teacher, Frau Albrecht, made the mistake of assigning a research project on local history. One student, Emil, chose the Gruber family. His parents protested quietly. But Frau Albrecht, a city-born woman, insisted it was educational. Emil began having nosebleeds, night terrors. He told classmates he saw hay in his bathtub. His drawings shifted from stick figures to scenes, barns, dark ladders, shapes in the rafters. In one, he drew his own home, but with a second shadowed roof layered above the real one, as if someone lived just above their lives. His final drawing depicted his house from below, looking up through floorboards that had no gaps. Above them, eyes stared down. Dozens. When asked about it, Emil smiled too long and said, "He doesn't blink because he doesn't need to." Frau Albrecht resigned after Emil went silent for 2 full weeks. She left town shortly after, citing persistent insomnia and a sensation of being watched. Others felt it too. A photographer working on a book of forgotten places captured a series of shots around the edge of the Hinterkaifeck woods. In the final image, among the blur of trees and frost, was a faint figure, arms too long, a face without distinction, standing precisely in the clearing's center. He didn't remember taking the photo, but the camera remembered. There are those who believe the murders were only the beginning, that Hinterkaifeck was never the story of a family destroyed, but of a door opened. Something came through, something formless, patient, something that learns. It has no name, or perhaps too many. It follows bloodline sphere architecture. It nests in old wood and newer doubt, and it waits. Because what happened in 1922 was not an ending. It was a seed, and seeds buried deep always remember the warmth of a house and the silence of a family asleep. By the early 2000s, Hinterkaifeck had faded from official memory. No tourist signs, no guided tours. The land remained unmarked, swallowed by woods that grew no denser, no thinner, just still. But the internet had a long memory. A thread on a forgotten message board sparked fresh curiosity. What really happened at Hinterkaifeck? Anonymous users traded theories. Some offered newspaper clippings, police reports, grainy autopsy images. Others offered more personal accounts. One post stood out. No username. Just an IP from somewhere in rural Bavaria. It read, "My grandmother worked as a maid at a neighboring farm. She said the Grubers were marked long before it happened, that someone visited them every year, same night, winter solstice, brought no gifts, left no footprints, just knocked 3 times. The post was removed within an hour, the account deleted, but the thread revived an old interest. A small team of amateur investigators, a pair of brothers and their friend, all in their 20s, set out to find the location in 2003. They documented their journey, GPS logs, photographs, tape recordings. They laughed in the early videos, joked, smoked cigarettes on the forest path. Then the entry stopped. 3 weeks later, one of the brothers was found wandering outside Ingolstadt, shoeless, dehydrated, covered in scratches that looked like letters but spelled no language. He never spoke again. Of the other 2, no trace was ever recovered. The family was told they had simply gotten lost. The woods are tricky in winter, authorities said. The snow covers more than just footprints, but one image uploaded to a private folder and time-stamped just hours before the disappearance remained accessible for a brief time. It showed the clearing, empty, gray, touched with frost, but in the upper right corner at the very edge of the frame, a face, pale, angular, watching. The eyes were open, but not wide. They were narrow, patient, expectant. The file was deleted before forensic backup could be recovered. Even now, conspiracy circles argue whether the case was ever solved, whether it can be solved. But in Grubern, no one asks. They know the difference between mystery and warning. They've lived with both. Every generation there is a new story. A hunter hears whispers in the trees that mimic his daughter's voice. A newborn won't stop crying unless moved to sleep in the attic. A woman dreams of snow falling through her ceiling, only to wake and find her hands caked in dirt and straw. None of these are ever reported, because they know the thing that came through the loft doesn't kill for pleasure, or revenge, or madness. It kills to remain, to root itself in silence, to wait for homes to forget how to be loud, for families to forget how to listen. And when it finds another house on the edge of winter, another home full of shadows and whispered grief, it knocks 3 times. The woods around Hinterkaifeck are quiet now, but not empty. Even the birds seem to avoid its heart, choosing higher branches, different canopies. The underbrush grows sparse, like the soil rejects new life. And the snow, when it falls, settles thicker here, muffling even the echo of your breath. No signs remain of the house, the barn, the path. But if you know what to look for, you'll feel it. The pressure in your ears like a storm building. The weight behind your ribs like being watched from inside your own body. And the silence total and unmoving. A silence that waits for your voice to break it. In 2021, a sound technician named Lucas traveled to the region to collect ambient forest noise for a horror film. He had read briefly about the Gruber murders, but dismissed the idea of visiting the site until his rental car's GPS rerouted him through a narrow, frost-laced road he hadn't programmed in. He claimed it was an accident, but he stopped anyway. He set up microphones at the edge of a field, letting the equipment roll while he stretched his legs and breathed in the brittle air. An hour passed, then 2. He collected his gear and left satisfied. That night, reviewing the audio back at the inn, he found something, a soft creaking, like old floorboards above him. A faint rhythmic sound beneath the white noise. Drag, pause, drag, pause, and then unmistakably a voice, not speaking, breathing, steady, deep, just behind the microphone. He had been alone. Lucas never used the recordings, but he still hears it when he edits, slipping into other tracks, bleeding between waveforms. A breath that was never captured by a mic. He's stopped sleeping in homes with attics. Others have begun to forget the name, Hinterkaifeck. New generations call it superstition, old trauma, misremembered history. But the land remembers. The thing that came through that attic remembers. It doesn't haunt. It waits. And in every place where a family sits too quietly, where grudges go unspoken, where prayers are whispered too late, It might find a new way in. It needs only space, a roof, a silence long enough to step into. So tonight, before you sleep, check your attic door. Make sure it's latched. Make sure it's empty. And if you hear something move above, you remember, the quiet is not always your friend. It might be listening, it might be learning, and it might already know your name. You've just walked through 10 layers of snow and shadow. If your heart's still racing, let's slow everything down now. Take a deep breath and let it go. Whatever followed us through tonight's story stays behind the door we've now closed. All those creaking steps, the attic whispers the breaths in the dark. They belong to the forest now, to the barn that no longer stands. They can't reach you here. Feel the weight leave your shoulders as you sink deeper into your bed. Hear the soft hum of your fan, the gentle stillness of your own space. This room is yours. The silence here is safe. Not watching, not waiting, just calm. Let your thoughts melt like the last traces of snow under morning sun. Let your heartbeat slow to the rhythm of deep sleep. You're far from that field now. Far from the footprints. Far from the loft and the frost. Here there is only warmth, only rest, and dreams untouched by breath that doesn't belong. So close your eyes. You made it through the storm, and nothing followed you home. 2. The blood-stained stable. Kentucky's silent curse. The stable had been there longer than anyone in Rowan Hollow could recall. It sat back off the county road past a sloping field of black-eyed Susans and bent cedar fence posts, half swallowed by trumpet vines and honeysuckle. Folks knew better than to go near it. Not because they believed in ghosts, but because animals always know first, and no animal that ever stepped inside the stable came out quite the same. Some would call it cursed, but no one ever said that word out loud. James Henley was not a man of stories. At 58, he'd worked the land his whole life, lost a son to the mines, a wife to the winter flu, and a dozen good horses to nothing he could explain. He kept to himself, tended his tobacco rows, and left the past where it belonged. But when his last horse, Millie, a gentle old mare, was found in the stable, with her neck twisted and eyes still open, something shifted. James stood there just inside the doorway, boots rooted to packed earth. Millie lay in the middle of her stall. No sign of struggle, no broken boards, no blood, only a thin reddish film across the hay, like someone had poured rust into the straw. Her hooves were clean, untouched. The air smelled wrong, like old metal and pond water. James didn't speak as he buried her, didn't curse, didn't cry. He only looked at the stable door once as he latched it shut again. From the outside, he thought about burning it. He really did, but it wouldn't take. The last man who'd tried to torch the place years ago after his colt turned rabid inside the stall wound up dead 2 nights later. Fell face first into his own pond lungs full of silt. Folks said it was just bad footing, slippery banks. But James remembered the look on the man's face at the funeral, the way his lips were turned up like he died laughing or smiling, and that was worse than any scream. So the stable stayed, and James left it be, until one night, just after the first frost of the season, he woke to the sound of wood groaning. Long low, like the old barn was breathing through its seams. He sat up slowly, listened. Another creak, then a soft, wet thud. Something was moving in the stable. He stepped into his boots, shrugged on his coat, and took the lantern from its hook. Outside, the wind was still, the kind of quiet that made you feel like the world was holding its breath. The light from the lantern was pale yellow, barely reaching past the porch. He crossed the yard with that slow, heavy gait of a man who doesn't want to believe what he already knows. With each step, the sound grew clearer. Not footsteps, not hooves, something dragging. Inside the stable, the air was thick. Still no blood, no signs of struggle. But in the middle of the main aisle, laid out like an offering, was a raccoon. torn open. Gutted, yet not a single drop of blood on the ground. Its eyes were missing. James stared at it for a long moment before he backed away. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the raccoon was gone. No tracks, just a muddy handprint on the door. High up, too high. It wasn't a child's hand, and it wasn't a man's. Something was in the stable, and it had let him see just enough to know it. James didn't tell anyone. He wasn't the kind of man who talked for comfort. The world as he knew it didn't give out sympathy for strange stories. He'd seen enough years to know that when something unnatural starts creeping in at the edges of your land, the last thing you want is for people to come looking. Instead, he went to town, bought salt, 4 large bags. The woman at the feed store raised a brow. "Winter ain't here yet," she said. James didn't reply, just paid in cash and walked out. That night, under a pale and indifferent moon, he salted the ground around the stable. A full circle, thick and tight. He sprinkled some over the doorframe, the hinges, the rusting horseshoe nailed above the arch. It made him feel like a fool, but not as much as doing nothing. The next morning, the salt was gone, not dissolved, not washed away, gone, like the earth had swallowed it. The horseshoe was gone too, torn from the wood cleanly, the nails still embedded. In its place was a line etched into the wood, deep and jagged, shaped like a crooked V. At first, James thought it might have been claws, but no animal he'd ever seen carved symbols into timber. He stood in the yard, eyes locked on that mark breath fogging in the cold air. He felt it then, a pressure, not wind, not weather, a presence. It was watching him from inside. He didn't open the door. Instead, he boarded it shut, plank after plank, nails driven in with shaking hands. He hammered until the sweat froze beneath his collar, and the old dog barked once from the porch, then whimpered into silence. But that night, just after the clock struck 3 a.m., the groaning started again. Longer this time, deeper. It echoed through the yard like the stable itself was waking up. James sat by the fire shotgun across his knees, lamp burning low. He didn't look out the window. He didn't need to. The sound wasn't asking. It was announcing. Something had survived the salt, survived the boards, or worse, had never left. By morning, the stable stood exactly as he'd left it. No broken boards, no scattered nails, but in the soil just outside the door, he found prints, not hoof prints, bare feet, wide, too wide, with toes that splayed like roots long and deep. There were 6 on each foot. They led from the stable across the yard and up the steps of the porch, right to his door. He followed the trail with lead in his stomach. At the top step, the print stopped. Not turned, not reversed. Stopped. Like the thing had sunk into the wood or vanished mid-step. James opened the door slowly, half expecting something to be waiting. But nothing was there. Except on the floor just inside, pressed into the dust from his boots, was another handprint. Smaller this time, child-sized. But again wrong. Too long. Too many joints. Fingers that bent too far. James didn't sleep for the next 2 nights. He tried to rationalize it, to anchor his thoughts in something solid. A trespasser, a prank, maybe even a fever dream. But the sound came back, always at 3:00, and the house grew colder. Even with the fire roaring, he saw frost rim the window panes from the inside. And worse, he began to hear whispers. Not words, whispers, rustling like dry hay being stirred by a slow hand. Breathing as if someone was crouched just behind the walls. Listening, the dog refused to enter the house. On the 3rd night, James lit every lamp he owned, let them burn through the oil, sat with his eyes open and the gun across his lap. And when the stable groaned again, he finally rose, walked out into the cold. No coat, no hat. He approached the stable with a lantern in one hand and a mouthful of prayers he hadn't spoken since childhood. The boards he had nailed across the door, gone, stacked neatly on the ground, as if someone had taken them down with care. And inside, something moved. He raised the lantern, stepped closer, and just before the light touched the far stall, just before it could reveal what waited inside, every flame on the farm snuffed out. All at once, like someone had inhaled the light itself. The dark that followed wasn't just the absence of light, it was complete. The kind that presses against your skin, thick as velvet, where you can feel the night moving. Even when the wind is dead still, James stood frozen, breath caught halfway between his lungs and his mouth. The lantern in his hand was dead, though the glass was still warm. He didn't dare move. And then, in that suffocating dark, came a sound, not from inside the stable, but above him. A creak long and low, as if someone or something shifted its weight across the rafters. Slowly, testing the boards, testing him. He felt at first a shiver not across his back, but inside his bones, like his body had remembered fear before his mind could name it. Then the breath came, warm, wet, close enough that he felt the damp of it on his cheek, like a slow exhale from something that had never been human. James turned and ran, didn't look back, didn't think. Just sprinted across the frozen grass with his feet barely finding purchase, his body remembering paths it hadn't run in decades. The farmhouse lights were still out, the world black as pitch, but he slammed through the door and through the deadbolt with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. It was an hour before the lamps flickered back to life, and when they did, he saw the handprints. Not one, not two, dozens, smudged across the windows, crawling up the walls, pressed along the baseboards inside his kitchen. Some small, some long, all of them pointed inward, not trying to escape, trying to come in. He spent the next day scrubbing burning sage, even tearing down a wall where the scratching never stopped. But the sound remained. That night he dreamt of the stable. He stood inside it, only it wasn't falling apart anymore. The wood was smooth, the hay clean. The stalls were full, but not with horses. Shadows flickered inside them, shifting, watching. In the dream, something called his name. Not loudly, just once, a whisper through the cracks in the boards. He didn't remember waking, only that his feet were muddy when the sun came up. He hadn't left the house. At least he didn't remember leaving. But the prints were back, leading up to his porch again. New ones, fresher. He called the preacher. Pastor Winslow was a man of heavy boots and heavy words, the kind that made their way out slow like syrup over a cold plate. He'd buried half the town, seen his share of grief, and didn't spook easy until he stepped inside James's house. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air changed. He paused, eyes scanning the corners of the room, like he was listening to something the others couldn't hear. James explained as best he could, left out the dreams, the handprints, but mentioned the noises, the cold, the horses. The preacher nodded once, then asked if James had ever seen anything. James said no, but his voice caught, because that wasn't true anymore. Pastor Winslow walked to the window, stared toward the stable, his lips barely moving. "There's something buried there," he said, beneath the stall floor, older than the nails, older than the land. Wasn't always a stable, James. James swallowed hard. What was it? Winslow didn't answer, just took out a small vial of oil from his coat, crossed the room and dabbed it on the corners of the windows, muttering low prayers between each motion. When he reached the fireplace, he stopped cold. Inside the hearth among the soot and ash lay a horseshoe, blackened, split down the middle, still warm. Winslow turned to James. "You need to leave," he said. "Tonight." James shook his head. "I've lived here all my life, and if you stay," the preacher said quietly, "you'll die here. But not like a man. Not like anything we can bury." That night James packed a bag, but he never made it to the truck, because when the clock hit 3:00 a.m., the stable door slammed open on its own, and something stepped out. James didn't see it at first. He heard it. The sound wasn't footsteps. Not exactly. More like dragging. Like hooves too long and too soft, scraping across gravel. A rhythm just off enough to feel wrong. His hand gripped the doorknob, but he didn't open it. Didn't move. Just stood there in the dark of his hallway, the dim kitchen lamp flickering behind him like a failing pulse. He counted the seconds between each sound. 1, 2, 3. Drag. 4. Then silence. He waited, held his breath until it felt like his lungs were folding in on themselves. When the next sound came, it wasn't at the stable. It was at the porch. He heard the wood groan beneath the weight just once. Then the soft, unmistakable click of something brushing against the doorframe. Slow, curious, as if sniffing it, or listening. Then a tap, faint, like a single knuckle. Then another, lower, then higher, as if the thing didn't know where the doorknob was supposed to be. James backed away step by step until his heel caught the edge of the rug. He didn't trip. He didn't scream. He just stood still. The tapping stopped. Then a whisper slid through the crack beneath the door, dry and hoarse like wind through corn stalks. "Open," James bolted. He grabbed the bag and his keys and ran out the back, stumbling into the wet grass with a mouth full of air that felt thick as syrup. The barn was behind him, the house at his back. But the sound, that dragging sound, was everywhere now. Not in one place, not on two legs. It was circling him. In the field under a moon choked by clouds, James spun in place like a man caught in a dream. But it wasn't a dream. Not anymore. The first flash of movement came near the tree line. A flicker. A shape. Pale and jointed like an insect, but tall, too tall. Its limbs bent wrong. Its head tilted too far to one side. James didn't wait. He ran. The truck started on the second turn of the key. Tires tore mud as he slammed it into gear and peeled away headlights, catching nothing but fog and fence posts. He didn't look back, not even when he passed the crossroads where the town began and the dark lost its teeth. He drove all night. No music, no talk radio, just the hum of the engine and the sound of something old unspooling behind his eyes. He didn't stop until he hit Lexington, checked into a motel under a false name, paid cash, didn't sleep. Not really. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the whisper, "Open." The preacher called him the next morning. How he found him, James never asked. He didn't need to. Winslow's voice was flat, dull, not frightened, just tired. "There's something under the barn, James." James didn't speak. "It's not new, and it's not yours. But you uncovered it. I never dug. You remembered. That's enough." There was a silence on the line. Then Winslow spoke again. "I'm going back to your place." "Don't," James said. "I have to." James closed his eyes. He already knew what would happen. People always say they'll leave, but some places won't let go until they've finished what they started. That night, James sat alone in the motel chair staring at the door, and when the clock hit 3:00 a.m., he didn't hear tapping. He heard the motel ice machine groan, then a whisper just outside the wall. "Found you." The knock came next. Not a loud one, not a fist pounding in anger, just a gentle, deliberate knock. 3 times. James didn't move, didn't breathe. He stared at the door, every muscle locked like it might hold something back. It knocked again. The motel hallway light seeped in through the cracks, soft and yellow. Ordinary. But beneath it, James saw the shadow shift. Not a person. Tall. Slender. A silhouette that bent where it shouldn't, like a coat rack draped in something too heavy. Something that twitched. Then silence. It didn't try the handle. Didn't call out again. Just waited. James sat frozen for what felt like hours, eyes unblinking, heart rattling like a loose wheel. And eventually, when no more sound came, he stood, eased across the room, held his breath, and looked through the peephole. Nothing. Not even footprints in the thin film of dust outside the door. But the smell remained, like rot, wet straw, and iron. He checked out before dawn, left the key on the nightstand, and drove without stopping, without thinking. The truck pulled him back to Rowan Hollow like it always would, like the road itself remembered. The house stood quiet as he approached. No smoke from the chimney. No light in the windows. The field sat cold and gray in the early light, but the stable door, wide open, boards scattered, salt blown to the edge of the yard, and just inside the threshold, a boot print. James's boot. Only not facing in, facing out, as if something had stepped into his skin and walked a mile in it. The preacher's truck was still in the drive, but no sign of Winslow. James called his name. No answer. He stepped slowly through the field, shotgun in one hand, the other brushing the edge of his coat pocket, where he'd stashed a pocket Bible days ago, now bent and water-stained, though it hadn't touched rain. Inside the stable, the stalls stood empty, but the scent was stronger, thicker, heavier. Like the moment before lightning splits the sky, he found Winslow in the far stall, standing, eyes open, mouth parted, motionless, like a man mid-thought, mid-prayer, only he wasn't breathing. His skin had turned a pale, almost waxen gray, not from cold, from something older. His chest didn't rise, his hands didn't twitch, but James swore his lips moved, just barely, repeating something over and over in a whisper not meant for any ear. He walked in, he walked in, he walked in. James backed out slowly, didn't turn his back. The preacher didn't follow, didn't blink. That night, James returned to town, this time not running, but with a purpose he couldn't quite name. He found the county clerk's office, asked to see the oldest land records for his property. The clerk was hesitant, but something in James's face, some cold he carried with him, made the man comply. The property had changed hands many times, but the land, that specific corner with the stable, had once belonged to a place known only as the Gather House, a religious commune, briefly registered in 1891, burned down in 1893 under unusual circumstances. No survivors, no arrests, only one note scribbled in the margin of an old fire report. Cellar sealed, refused to open, ground bled. James stared at the words for a long time, then asked, was there a well? The clerk frowned, shuffled pages, nodded slowly. Yeah, right under where your barn sits now, filled in, I think, sealed with stone. But James knew. It had never been sealed, not properly. The thing in the stable hadn't come from outside. It hadn't moved in. It had risen. He left the office without another word, drove home, parked outside the house, and watched the stable. It was waiting, and somewhere behind the boards and old hay, whatever he was, knew James was finally ready to see the truth. James didn't go inside that night. He sat on the porch with a flask in one hand and the shotgun across his knees, the same way he had years ago when the fever took his wife, and there was nothing left to do but wait. The moon was sharp in the sky, casting pale light over the fields, and that damned stable, its doors still cracked like it was smiling. Something about the air had changed. It was too still, too clean. The way a church smells after too much incense, or the world does before a storm when every living thing holds its breath. And behind that stillness, James could feel the hum, low, almost musical, like an old voice humming just under the edge of silence, vibrating through the bones of the land. Just before 3 a.m., he stood, crossed the field one last time. He didn't bring the shotgun, didn't bring salt. He carried only the rusted horseshoe he'd dug from the hearth and the Bible that now felt heavier than it should have. The stable welcomed him. No wind, no sound, just that soft, persistent hum beneath the floor. He stepped inside. The air was warm, thick, and he realized the smell had changed, not rot, not mold. It smelled sweet, like honeysuckle and turned earth, a scent he remembered from summers long past. The stalls were empty, the walls still stained with old blood that never faded, but his eyes were drawn to the far side where the floor dipped slightly, just enough to form a shallow pit. Bare earth, no straw, no boards, just stone, a circle of stones, rough, irregular, and black with soot. The old well. James approached, feet silent on the hay-dusted floor. Each step seemed to echo louder than it should, and the closer he got, the clearer the hum became. It was coming from the stones, from beneath. He knelt beside the pit. The stones were warm. He reached down against every instinct that screamed not to and touched the center, and then the humming stopped. For the first time in days, in weeks, there was no sound, and then slowly something answered from below. A voice. Not loud, not even a whisper. Just there. You opened it. James froze. The voice wasn't from his ears. It vibrated inside him, curling through his chest like breath he didn't take. I've waited a long time. He tried to speak, but his lips wouldn't move. Only his hand, the one touching the stone, began to burn. He looked down. Blood was seeping from beneath his palm. Not his blood. It welled up through the cracks in the stone. Thick, black, and warm. He yanked his hand back, stumbling as he fell against the stall wall behind him, gasping. And then, movement. The earth within the stone circle stirred, like something was pushing up from below. He watched heart hammering as the soil swelled, cracked, opened, and out of it rose a shape. Not tall, not wide, just wrong. A figure the color of ash and bone. Its face was almost human. Almost. But the eyes were too round, too deep. And its mouth, too still. It didn't blink. It didn't breathe. It stood there in silence, staring at James. And then it smiled. A slow curling motion like skin being peeled back. James tried to move, but his legs wouldn't obey. The thing stepped forward. One step, then two. And finally it spoke again, though the mouth didn't move. You remembered, so now I do. He didn't understand. Didn't want to understand. But somehow in some deep ancestral corner of his mind he knew. The thing had once been called here, fed, forgotten, and now it needed to be remembered again. He was the first. He wouldn't be the last. As the thing stepped closer, James felt the blood run down his arm, hot as summer rain, and the stable seemed to breathe with him, groaning in the wood, sighing in the rafters. We begin again, it said. Open the door. And James, without meaning to, stood, and turned, and walked toward the stable doors. James didn't feel his feet on the ground as he crossed the stable floor. The boards seemed to shift beneath him, creaking in rhythm with a pulse that wasn't his own. The air was too warm, too still, and yet his breath came in white puffs, like something was freezing him from the inside out. The stable doors loomed ahead, wide open now, letting the moon spill across the hay-strewn threshold. Outside, the field lay silver and silent. Nothing moved. No wind. No animals. No stars. Behind him, he could hear it. That soft, rhythmic sound of something walking. Not dragging. Not crawling. Walking. The thing was learning. It was wearing its shape better, and every step brought it closer to the world it had been pushed out of. He reached the threshold and stopped. His hand hovered above the iron latch, not to close it, but to hold it open, to welcome. The voice slithered up behind him, not loud, not cruel, just eager. Say the name. James shook his head. The pain started then. Not sharp, not immediate. It began in his teeth. A pressure like roots twisting under his gums. Then, in his bones stretching, bending as if his body wanted to curl into the floorboards and disappear. He dropped to his knees, and still the thing stood behind him, waiting. It would not cross the threshold without permission, without an invitation, without a name. James tried to crawl forward, but his limbs betrayed him. He felt the warmth of blood dripping from his ears. The smell of honeysuckle turned sweet enough to rot. Then came the humming again, the lullaby. He remembered it now, from childhood. A song his mother sang when his brother died in the crib. He'd never questioned it back then, but now he heard the words for what they were. Old words, wrong words, summoning words. He'd been taught them like a prayer, not knowing what they fed. Say the name. The voice was louder now, pressing against the base of his skull, curling into his thoughts like smoke. Let me walk. James clenched his jaw. Blood pooled at the corner of his lips. He tried to stand, legs trembling beneath him. The pain surged, his body no longer his own, and yet something resisted, some flicker of will, a voice older than the humming, clearer than the whispers, his wife's voice, her hand on his shoulder the night their son died, the warmth of her palm. You held him, she'd said. You didn't let go. James closed his eyes, held on to that, and whispered something back, not the name it wanted, but one it had no use for. Eloise. The air shattered, the humming stopped, and behind him the thing shrieked, not with sound, but absence. The field outside rippled. The moon blinked out. The wood beneath his knees cracked. He turned. The stall was empty. The stones cold. The stable silent. No footprints. No shape. No voice. James stood slowly, knees weak, hands trembling. He stumbled out of the stable into the field, and the sky above breathed again. A single breeze stirred the grass. The stars returned, flickering like uncertain candles. He looked back only once, The doors had closed behind him, sealed. But he knew this wasn't an ending. It was a stall, a delay. Something had stirred. Something had almost come through, and it would wait again. Wait for the next name, the next door, the next memory. James walked home in silence. Behind him, the field watched. James didn't speak of it. Not to the sheriff. Not to the preacher's widow. Not to the quiet-faced boy from the feed store who came asking when the smoke from the stable stopped rising. He returned to his house, boarded the doors from the inside, and hung thick blankets over the windows. The phone line went dead a few days later. He didn't call for help. He didn't want it. Not anymore. There were nights he would wake with dried blood at the corners of his eyes. Nights when he'd find old hymns scrawled in ash across the walls. The Bible beside his bed no longer stayed shut. Its pages peeled open to a verse he didn't remember marking. Ezekiel. Chapter 8. Dig now in the wall. He didn't dig, but the dreams did. The stable returned to him in sleep, perfect and whole. Clean straw, warm breath, gentle creaks. He'd walk through it without fear, guided by memory. And each time at the far end, there was a mirror, floor to ceiling, silver-edged and flickering. And in the mirror, he wasn't alone. He never saw the thing directly, just glimpses, a reflection out of step with his own. It smiled too soon. It blinked too slow. And behind it rows of others, dozens, hundreds, all watching from within the glass. Not trapped, just waiting. One night he woke with splinters in his palms. The stable was still sealed. He hadn't left his bed, and yet the taste of hay clung to his tongue. He knew then that the barrier between what had almost returned and what still could was breaking slowly, like thawed earth after a long winter. It wasn't about the stable. It never had been. That was only the mouth. The thing inside wanted a voice, a memory to root itself into. A host, he began to write. Not a confession, not a journal, a story. He wrote everything: the death of Millie, the sound in the rafters, the smell of rust and straw, the hum. The name it asked for, the name he would not give. He filled page after page in long, careful strokes, but the handwriting changed. Somewhere around page 12, the letters grew thinner, longer, like someone else's hand had taken over. By page 20, the words weren't English anymore, just symbols, arcs, hooks, lines that dipped and bent like the ridges of a skull. He burned the pages, or tried to. They didn't catch, just blackened at the corners and shriveled like leaves that had already rotted from within. And then he saw the marks. Not in the house, not even on the property, on people. The boy from the feed store had a shadow that didn't quite match his shape. The mail carrier flinched at loud noises, like they echoed louder in his ears. The woman from the diner cried without reason, wiping her cheeks and muttering, "I'm not me. I'm not me." It was spreading, not fast, just wide, like spores. James sat on the porch for the first time in weeks, listening. No breeze, no insects. Just that low, familiar hum beneath the hills. He wondered how long it had been there before the Grangers built the stable, before the gather house, before names were needed at all. Maybe the land had always wanted something, and maybe they had simply fed it too well. He rose, walked to the barn. Not the stable, he'd never return there. The barn where the old wood still remembered what it was like to be untouched by hands. Inside, he found the well tools, shovels, rope, a rusted pick. He wasn't going to dig, he was going to seal. Properly. Whatever still breathed beneath the stones, whatever dreamed of shape and name and voice, it would find him waiting. And this time he would not run. He worked through the night. The cold settled into his bones like silt in water, slow and heavy. But James didn't stop. With each shovel of earth, each rock he moved, he whispered the old names he remembered from childhood hymns. Not the ones taught in school, but the ones hummed by tired mouths, too scared to speak them aloud. He wasn't sure they still held power, but it made the silence more bearable. By morning, his hands were blistered and raw. The pit had deepened beneath the stable's far stall, exposing the old circle of stones. Beneath them, black soil that smelled not of rot, but of hunger. It pulsed almost imperceptibly, like breath. He dropped the last of the salt into the cracks, laid the horseshoe in the center, and then began to pour the concrete. He'd mixed it in silence, bucket by bucket, dragging the weight from the barn across the frost-bitten grass down into the pit. The wheelbarrow creaked with each load, its rusted wheels protesting the task. But it held. The mix steamed as it hit the cold stones, bubbled once, then quieted, like something had gone still beneath it, as if the land knew this was a final door, and it had shut. He worked until the sun sat high, until the pit was full, until every inch of stone and earth and memory was buried under a seal of gray. Then he stood back and waited. No sound, no breath, no whisper. The humming was gone, but so was the warmth in his limbs. He staggered home, the sky above wide and blue and sharp. The house looked older now, slouched in on itself like it had been waiting for him to return before it could collapse. Inside, dust floated like breathless ghosts in the light from the windows. Everything was still until he reached the hallway. The floor creaked, not with weight but release, and on the wall beside his bedroom door, someone or something had drawn a symbol, a perfect circle with a line through it. He hadn't made it. He was sure of that. It pulsed faintly like heat trapped in ink. James didn't touch it, didn't speak. He turned off the lights, sat in his chair, and waited for night. At 3 a.m. nothing came. No knocking, no breath, no footsteps in the hay. But he didn't sleep. He couldn't, because the silence wasn't right. It was too clean, too still, like something wasn't resting. It was listening, from far away perhaps, but not gone, never gone. He opened his Bible to the page it always seemed to find now. Ezekiel 8, dig now in the wall. He read it again, slowly, and then closed the book. The door had been sealed, the name withheld, the memory buried. But in the quiet of that hour, as the frost thickened on the windows, James whispered something aloud to no one in particular. I didn't open it. He paused, looked toward the stable, half hidden behind mist and old wood. I just remembered it, and somewhere deep in the earth, something smiled. The days that followed were uneventful in the way only cursed land can be still cold, full of shadows that didn't move, and air that felt like a breath withheld. James didn't leave the house. He ate little, slept less. Each evening, he watched the stable from his porch, not because he feared what might come out, but because he feared it wouldn't. That, what he had sealed beneath the stone and concrete, was not finished, but waiting. Again, always. His hands, once steady, had begun to tremble. It started in the mornings. By dusk, it would fade. But at 3 a.m., without fail, he'd wake with the taste of dirt in his mouth, the copper tang of blood, the scent of honeysuckle rotting in the walls. He kept the Bible beside him still, though he no longer opened it. Its pages had warped in the damp. Mold crept along the edges like ink that couldn't decide what to become. On the 12th night, something changed. A knock, not at the door. From inside the house, 3 knocks. From within the wall behind his chair. He didn't rise, didn't speak, just sat in the hush that followed his breath, shallow eyes fixed on the dark corner of the room where the wallpaper had begun to peel. And then a whisper, dig now in the wall. Not a threat, a reminder. It had followed him, not the shape, not the thing from the stable, the memory. The voice wasn't in his ears now. It was in the floorboards, in the seams of the house. In the quiet way, the glass in the windows trembled when he blinked. He had sealed the door, but the house had remembered, and houses don't forget. He stood slowly, felt the weight of it all pressing behind his ribs. Not fear, familiarity. It had lived here once. It had been fed here. It knew the way back, and now so did he. He walked down the hall, bare feet against cool wood, past the kitchen, past the cellar door, to the far end of the house, to the wall that faced the stable, where the paint had cracked in long vertical lines. He reached for it, pressed his fingers to the surface, and felt warmth, not from behind the wall, from inside it, like the house had grown a second heart. He leaned in, listened, and there it was again, that hum, soft, patient, waiting, not rising, not angry, just there, always. He didn't dig, didn't speak, didn't write another word, because he finally understood. This was not a curse to lift, not a demon to drive out. It was a truth, buried so long it forgot its own name. It didn't need a body, or a voice, just a place, and James had given it that. He sat back down in the chair by the window, watched the frost creep across the pane, like fingers tracing a story no one remembered. And when he closed his eyes, he saw the stable, perfect and full, and he knew it was open again. Not from digging, not from names, but from remembering. And somewhere far away, or maybe very close, others would begin to remember too. A lullaby, a shadow, a stable where horses won't go, a voice in the wall asking gently, "Open." You made it through. You walked the hollow fields, the frost-bitten grass, the quiet stable. You felt the hush behind the walls and the pull of something older than words. But here, in this moment, you're safe. Let's let go now. Breathe in, deep, slow, and let it go. Let the tension melt from your shoulders. Let your jaw unclench. Let the thoughts that stirred during tonight's tale fall quiet like the snow outside that stable, untouched and still. The horses are gone. The doors are closed. The voice has no name tonight. You are far from that house now. Far from the boards that creak without cause. Far from the hum beneath the floor. There is only your room, your breath, the soft sound of whatever calms you. Rain, wind, fan. Let it carry you. If your thoughts drift back, that's okay. That's natural. But they're only echoes now, faint, distant, like a dream that lingers too long in morning light. Sleep will come soon. The good kind, the kind that holds you quiet and deep and safe. So settle in. Let your body grow heavy. Let the story fall behind, like a barn in the fog, familiar but fading. You've done well. You've listened closely. And now it's time to forget, to rest, to drift. Whatever waits beyond the door can wait a little longer. You don't have to open it. Not tonight. Not ever. 3. Singing in the cornfields. The Peterson farm. The Peterson farm had stood for generations, weather-worn and steady. A white clapboard house with chipped paint. A barn slouched against the sky like an old man's shoulder. And 50 acres of corn that stretched far beyond the fence line, bending with every breath of wind. Most folks in the area drove past without a glance. But the ones who lived nearby, they remembered. Not anything dramatic, just odd things. Dogs that wouldn't go near the fields. Radios that picked up static when driving past. Children who spoke of the lady in the corn and the way the song would change depending on whether you listened with your eyes closed. When Clara and David Peterson inherited the farm in late summer, they didn't think much of it. The house had belonged to David's uncle, an old bachelor who died in his sleep. Peaceful, they said. Natural. But the coroner had written something odd in the notes. No cause of death, no injury, just a final observation. Mouth open. No damage to vocal cords. Ears bleeding. The doctor didn't speculate. He just looked tired. David never saw the report, but Clara did. She folded it quietly and placed it in the back of the kitchen drawer beneath expired coupons and dead batteries. They moved in during the last days of August. The corn was high, then golden and thick. The air smelled of damp soil and sweet decay. At night, the windows breathed fog, and the wind would lift the corners of the curtains, even when the glass was shut. The first night they heard the singing, soft, faint, almost beautiful. David thought it was the wind. Clara wasn't so sure. She woke before dawn, padding barefoot to the porch with a blanket around her shoulders. The corn swayed, though the air was still. In the pre-light haze, she could almost see someone almost walking the narrow path between the rows. A figure. Slow. Graceful. But when she blinked, it was gone, and the singing faded with it. The days passed quietly. The farmhouse settled into them like dust in corners. They painted the kitchen, hung up curtains, scrubbed the grime from the windows until the glass shone clear. And every evening, just after the sun dipped below the edge of the field, the singing returned. Sometimes it was closer, sometimes it came from the far end of the property, so faint it felt like a memory. Clara began to hum along without realizing it. David asked her once, half laughing, "How do you know the tune?" She didn't answer, because she didn't know. There was no melody, no repetition, just a long, slow sound like a breath held across time. One night the wind picked up sharp. David went to check the barn. He returned an hour later, pale. "There's something in the field," he said. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. But the corn, it bends when it shouldn't. I thought it was an animal, but it moved like it was listening." They didn't sleep well after that. The singing continued. Each night it came closer. Once Clara woke with the sound of it right outside the bedroom window. She didn't look. She didn't want to know what face sang so sweetly through the glass. The next morning, Clara found footprints outside the window. Not boot prints, not bare feet, something in between. Long, narrow impressions sunk deep into the damp soil, like whatever had stood there hadn't quite touched the ground, but pressed through it. The prints led into the corn and stopped. She didn't tell David. He was already uneasy, pretending not to be. Fixing the same fence twice, pacing the porch like he was waiting for a noise that wouldn't come. Instead, she walked the edge of the field alone. The rose whispered beside her tassels, rustling though there was no breeze. At times, she thought she could hear the singing again, not in the air, but below it, beneath the wind, beneath the earth, like something ancient humming through roots. She found an old scarecrow near the fence line. She didn't remember it being there when they arrived. Its frame was crooked arms long and too thin. The hat was molded to the scalp, like skin, the mouth stitched into a tight, knowing curve. There were bones in its hands, not wood, small, like bird bones. She backed away, didn't touch it, didn't look it in the eyes. The next day it was gone. No sign it had ever been staked into the ground. That night, the power flickered, twice. The bulbs dimmed to orange, then surged back. The air grew heavy like the kind that settles before a summer storm, thick and waiting. David didn't speak much anymore. He sat near the window eyes on the corn. He said he saw someone in there. A girl, he thought. Long black hair, pale dress. She never moved, just stood between the stalks, barely visible. Clara asked how he could be sure it wasn't a trick of the light. He didn't answer. And then after midnight, the house filled with singing. No longer outside. It came from the vents, the attic, the walls, soft and low, threading through the house like smoke. Clara covered her ears, but the sound wasn't in her ears anymore. It was inside, like it had always been there, waiting for something to wake it up. She whispered, "Stop," and the house obeyed. Instantly. No fade, no echo, just silence. And then the hallway light turned on by itself. They didn't leave the room until dawn. The house was quiet, but something had changed. The corn no longer swayed. It stood too still, too straight, like it was listening now, like it was waiting. Later that day, Clara opened the drawer in the kitchen, the one where she had hidden the coroner's report. It was gone. In its place was a piece of paper, unlined, yellowed, a child's handwriting. Only 3 words. "She remembers you." Clara stared at the paper, her breath catching. The handwriting was uneven, like it had been written slowly by someone unused to letters. The ink had bled slightly, as if the page had absorbed something more than just words. She didn't show David, didn't say a word. She folded the note, placed it inside a book on the shelf, one of the old farm ledgers that hadn't been opened in years, and pushed it behind the others. Out of sight, but not out of mind, because the message lingered. "She remembers you." That afternoon, Clara walked the property again. The sun beat low and red across the sky, casting long shadows across the rows. The corn stood silent, still. Even the insects were quiet now. Something about that quiet felt wrong, too complete. She found herself near the far edge of the property, where the stalks thinned and the old stone well lay buried beneath vines. She hadn't seen it before. It was almost completely hidden. The lid had cracked just slightly, and something about it made her stomach turn. The stones were cold, not from shade, but from something deeper. As she reached out to touch the edge, a breeze stirred. the first in days, but it didn't come from the sky. It rose up from the well itself, carrying with it the faintest sound of singing, low, childlike. She remembers you. Clara stepped back, heart pounding. There was something in the air now. Not cold, not hot, just wrong. Like air that had been somewhere else for too long and didn't quite fit this place anymore. That night she sat on the edge of the bed while David slept, his face turned to the wall. She didn't sleep. Couldn't. Not with the sound beginning again, this time under the floorboards. It came in pulses like breathing through a reed. A lullaby with no melody, just a tone that shifted ever so slightly, as if adjusting to her presence. She stood in the hallway listening. The floor creaked behind her. She turned, but no one was there, only the faint scent of dry hay and old rain. Then something brushed her shoulder. Not a hand, not air, just a presence. And when she looked to the hallway mirror, she saw herself. But something else stood beside her, a shape, not reflected in the hallway, only in the glass. It didn't move, it didn't speak, just stared. The outline of a girl, hair long and tangled, eyes wide and waiting, mouth slightly open as if mid-song. Clara turned away, heart hammering, but the humming followed her down the hall, soft as breath. She woke David, tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. He sat up, blinked slowly and said, "She's only singing to you," then laid back down and turned away. The next day Clara found him in the field, standing between the rows, mouth open, eyes closed, hands at his sides. The corn around him didn't move. She called his name. He didn't answer. When she stepped closer, the singing stopped, abruptly, and David collapsed into her arms like a marionette cut loose. That night he didn't speak at all, just stared at the ceiling, lips parted like he was still listening to something she couldn't hear. The next morning the mirror was gone, ripped from the wall. Only a perfect clean square of faded wallpaper remained, and in the dust on the floor below it, someone had traced another message. "She's almost here." By the time the sun rose fully, Clara had made up her mind. They had to leave. She stood at the kitchen counter, knuckles white against the edge, watching David from the corner of her eye. He moved slowly now, careful, like his body didn't fit right inside itself. He hadn't spoken since the incident in the corn. When she asked him what he remembered, he simply blinked and said, "It was warm," then smiled just a little too long. She didn't ask again. Instead, she packed a small bag. Essentials only. Wallet, keys, a single photo of them from 3 summers ago, both of them sunburned and laughing. She placed the folded note in the side pocket, the one that said, "She remembers you." They could drive into town, stay at a motel, figure it out from there, sell the farm if they had to, burn the fields. It didn't matter anymore. But when she turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. Not a sputter, not a click. The battery was fine. Everything was fine. And yet the truck sat still and silent, like it had forgotten how to leave. She looked up and froze. There was someone standing at the edge of the cornfield, just inside the first row, not moving, dressed in white, hair black and long. No face visible, just a shape blurred by heat and distance. Clara stepped back from the window. David stood behind her now. She hadn't heard him approach. "She's been waiting a long time," he said softly. Clara turned. His eyes were glassy, unblinking. His lips didn't move when he spoke again. "You sang first." She wanted to scream, but the moment passed. The figure in the field was gone, and David returned to his chair as if nothing had happened. That night the wind returned. It howled low through the rafters, lifting loose bits of wallpaper and knocking a single glass from the sink. The humming began again, this time layered like more than one voice, a chorus almost, and the song had structure now, a rhythm. Clara couldn't place it, but it felt old, older than the house, older than the corn. It pulsed through the walls like a heartbeat she didn't recognize as her own. She tried blocking her ears. Didn't help. She tried humming over it. Made it worse. The tune responded, mimicking her, mirroring her, echoing her breath until she couldn't tell where hers ended and its began. The next morning, she found a row of small stones on the front porch, arranged in a perfect circle. Inside it, a strand of her own hair tied into a knot. She didn't remember leaving the house. Didn't remember brushing her hair. David was gone. Not missing, just absent. His boots sat by the door. His coat hung neatly by the peg, but he was nowhere inside. Clara searched the barn, the corn, the well, nothing, until she heard the singing again, this time clear, right behind her. She turned slowly, but no one was there, only the corn parting softly like breath. She walked back to the house with her hands trembling, the echo of that lullaby chasing her heels. Inside she found him. David sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, eyes wide. He smiled faintly and whispered, "She wants to be remembered." Clara shook her head. "This isn't real," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, they felt hollow, like the kind of thing you say to keep something in the dark a little longer. On the table beside him lay another note. Same paper, same handwriting. Dig where it ended. The note sat there, unmoving, as if it had always belonged to the table. Clara didn't reach for it right away. She stared at it, the words dancing slowly in her mind, like dust in sunlight. Dig where it ended. Her throat was dry. She asked David what it meant. He didn't answer, didn't blink, just kept that small smile as if hearing something sweet and private in a room full of noise. She stood slowly backing away from the table. His gaze didn't follow her, not even when she left the room. Outside, the air had shifted. The corn was moving again, not swaying but parting, like something large was walking through it. Deliberate, unseen. She didn't wait to see what. Instead, she went to the barn. It was the oldest structure on the property, sagging and leaning into itself, like a man deep in thought. Inside, dust floated like ash, and the smell of dry hay clung to her clothes like fingers. She searched in silence. Old tools, rusted blades, a wheelbarrow half collapsed, and in the far corner beneath a moth-eaten tarp, something heavy. She pulled it back. A shovel, wooden, splintered at the handle, and something else, a child's boot half buried in the straw. It was small, leather cracked, stuffed with corn husks. She touched it gently. It crumpled in her hand. Dig where it ended. She thought of the well, of the cracked stone lid. She made her way back to it, each step through the corn heavier than the last. The stalks closed around her, whispering things just out of hearing. Her skin prickled. The well waited, still broken, still breathing. She placed the shovel against the earth and drove it in. The ground gave easily, too easily, like it had been loosened not by time but by memory. She dug, foot by foot, until the shovel hit wood, soft, rotten. She cleared the dirt with her hands. A box, no nails, just a crude hand-built coffin. She froze. Every breath around her stopped. Even the wind fell silent. She opened the box. Inside lay a girl, or what was left of her. Hair, long and dark, braided with small threads of corn silk. Dress pale and rotted. Hands, folded fingers interlocked with dry roots. Her mouth was open, but not from a scream, from a song. Even now, Clara could hear it. Leaking from between her teeth, no louder than the wind, no clearer than a heartbeat underwater. The girl's eyes were gone, just hollow dark sockets, and in her lap an old locket. Clara picked it up with shaking fingers. Inside a faded photo of a farmhouse. This farmhouse, and a single name carved behind it. Elspeth. She stepped back. The corn groaned around her, bending low like something bowing. The hum returned. But this time it wasn't just a song. It was words. Not in a language Clara understood, but in a cadence that pulled tears from her eyes. A grief song. A calling. The box had been buried, forgotten, but the song had never stopped, only waited. It had lived in the walls, in the mirrors, in the whispers between wind gusts. It had needed someone to remember. Now it had her. She stumbled back to the house locket clenched in her fist. David was still at the table, still smiling. She dropped the locket in front of him. "I found her," she whispered. His smile faded, just slightly. Then quietly he said, "That's not where it ended." He looked at her for the first time in days, and there was something in his eyes, something new. She didn't want to be found, he said. She wanted to come back, and outside the singing rose again. Full, clear, and so close. Clara didn't speak. Couldn't. Her breath sat like a stone behind her ribs as the singing filled every crevice of the house. It threaded beneath the floorboards, seeped through the walls, slid between her teeth, and curled around her spine. This time, It had a shape round and soft like a nursery rhyme, but wrong in rhythm, unfamiliar in pitch. David's eyes were fixed on the window now. His hands slowly unfolded, resting palm down on the table as if preparing for something. Clara wanted to run, wanted to scream, but she felt rooted to the floor the same way the corn never bent, unless it was told to. "She's here," David whispered, not as a warning, but as a welcome. Outside, the air shifted. No breeze, no wind, but a weight like the field had leaned closer to the house. Shadows stretched across the porch as the light dimmed, not from sunset, but from something passing overhead. Clara walked to the window. Slowly. Every part of her telling her not to look, not to see. But she did. The corn had parted again, and standing at the edge of the field, right where the earth turned to gravel, was the girl. Elsbeth. She was exactly as she had been in the coffin. Same pale dress, same black hair. Only her face was full now, lips moving, singing without sound. And then she stepped forward, one bare foot onto the grass, then another, her eyes still dark, still hollow. The house groaned as if it recognized her. David stood, his voice barely audible. She remembers the house. Clara backed away from the window, heart thundering in her throat. She felt the song shift, then bend toward her. Not louder, but more focused, like a melody trying to match her breath. Elsbeth walked slowly, her dress whispering over the grass, her bare feet leaving no imprint. As she reached the porch, the song stopped. Silence, complete. Then 3 knocks, gentle, even, like the request of a child asking to be let in. David walked toward the door. Clara moved to stop him, but he turned and said softly, "You already opened it." He reached for the handle. Clara shouted his name. Too late. The door opened, and there was no one on the other side, only air, still and thick, and the smell, damp hay, crushed corn, something sweet beginning to spoil. David stepped out onto the porch and vanished. Clara gasped and ran after him, stumbling into the twilight, but there was no sign of him. No figure in white, no footsteps in the dirt, only the sound of rustling stalks returning to their place. Only the wind, finally blowing. And then the house behind her began to sing, not from the walls this time, from beneath, from the earth. 1,000 voices layered and hollow, calling out the same broken tune over and over, rising into a crescendo that vibrated the windows and made the porch boards quake beneath her feet. Clara turned back toward the field. Her hands shook, but something had settled in her. Not calm, not courage. Something deeper, something like memory. She whispered the name once under her breath. Elsbeth. The corn stopped moving, and the wind held its breath. The name lingered in the air like smoke curling through the silence that followed. Clara stood at the edge of the porch, frozen. The wind didn't stir. The insects had gone quiet again. Even the frogs by the irrigation ditch had ceased their chorus. She wasn't sure why she'd said it. Elsbeth only that the name had settled in her, like something remembered, not learned. The field stretched before her still and golden, the stalks locked in place like sentinels. She stepped off the porch. The dirt under her bare feet was warm, pulsing faintly with a rhythm she could almost recognize. Not a heartbeat. Something slower, older, like the breath of the land itself. She walked, past the porch, past the edge of the house, past the spot where David had disappeared. The corn didn't move this time. It waited. When she reached the rows, they parted, not violently, not as if forced, but willingly. Opening, inviting. She stepped in. The temperature dropped immediately. The sun vanished above her, as if the stalks had swallowed it. The only light was that strange gray hue that falls beneath dense canopy like twilight before a storm. She kept walking. Each step pressed deeper into the soil, her heels sinking slightly. The ground damp like it had just rained. but there had been no rain. Not for days. The humming returned soft at first, barely there. It sounded different now, like a girl trying to remember the words to a lullaby she hadn't sung in years. Clara followed it, drawn by something beyond curiosity. She no longer felt afraid, just strangely certain. Certain that if she turned back, the field would not let her go. After what felt like an hour, she entered a clearing, perfectly circular, hidden deep within the rows. At its center stood the scarecrow, the same one she'd seen before, but now it was clean, new, no mold, no torn hat. Its limbs were straight, and its arms extended like they were mid-embrace, and around its base, 6 small stones, placed carefully in a circle. Clara stepped forward. The humming grew louder. She wasn't alone. On the far side of the clearing, something moved between the corn. Slow. Steady. A girl stepped forward. Elsbeth, her dress torn at the edges, stained with soil, her long black hair caught in the breeze that touched nothing else. She didn't look at Clara. Not yet. She walked to the scarecrow and touched its sleeve gently, like one might greet a friend after years apart. And then she sang, clear now, hauntingly simple, a lullaby with no words. The same tune that had plagued the house for nights on end. Clara stood silently. Something about the song tugged at her chest, not with fear, but sorrow. It felt like grief, like remembrance. Elsbeth turned slowly. Her eyes were still hollow, still wrong, but her mouth moved with perfect grace, and the song slipped from her lips like it belonged to the soil. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but Elsbeth raised one hand. The singing stopped. Silence. Then a voice not sung, but spoken. Dry, uneven, like words spoken for the first time in years. You put me on the ground. Clara's knees nearly gave. She whispered, no, I didn't. I wasn't. But the girl continued, you forgot me. I didn't know, Clara said. I didn't know who you were. Elsbeth tilted her head. You knew the song. I didn't, Clara stopped, because that wasn't true. She had known the song. Somewhere deep inside it had felt familiar. She had hummed it without thinking. She remembered singing it to herself as a child on long car rides on cold nights, but no one had taught it to her. Elsbeth stepped closer. You were there, she whispered, and the corn swayed all around them as the sky darkened above. You watched them cover the well. Clara stepped back. I was a child. Elsbeth's face didn't change. You didn't speak. The humming returned soft now behind Clara, behind the corn all around. A chorus of children, their voices layered like leaves on the ground. I didn't know, Clara said again, but her voice faltered, because now she did. The dream, the flashes of memory, the farmhouse years ago, her mother's hands on her shoulders, being told to stay inside, watching from the window as men with shovels filled in something at the edge of the field. A box, small, a girl's face glimpsed only once, Elsbeth, buried, forgotten, and the song had lived on, waiting. Clara fell to her knees, the truth crashing over her like wind through dry stalks. I'm sorry, she whispered. Elsbeth's expression didn't change. She stepped closer. You remembered, she said. Now I can come back. And Clara understood. The song wasn't a call for vengeance. It was a door, and memory was the key. The clearing felt tighter now, as if the corn had crept closer. The wind had gone entirely still, and even Elsbeth's dress no longer moved. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic rustling beyond the circle footsteps, maybe, or the land itself shifting in response to her name. Clara stayed on her knees, heart beating slow and loud in her ears. The scent of earth, sweet and wet, thickened around her. Elsbeth stood over her silent. The girl's mouth no longer moved, but the song hadn't stopped. It came now from everywhere at once. Clara could feel it vibrating through her skin, humming in her teeth. It wasn't angry. It was insistent, like a melody that had waited too long to be sung again. I didn't bury you, Clara said quietly, but I knew. Her voice was thin, dry, like old cloth. I knew something was wrong that day, but no one listened to a child. Elsbeth blinked once, slowly. Her eyes were still empty, but Clara felt them on her. You listened now. The girl's voice was the hush between notes, the breath after a lullaby. The stones at the base of the scarecrow trembled ever so slightly. The ground beneath them flexed, and from the soil came a soft, cracking sound, like a seed opening. Elsbeth turned toward it. From the dirt, something pushed up through the earth. A small sprig at first, then more, thin white roots curling into the air like fingers. The stones shifted. The center of the circle opened. Not a hole, a mouth. Clara watched, frozen as the roots thickened, grew, wove themselves around each other. The smell of rain and rot filled her nose. She was never buried, right? Elsbeth said, not looking at her, only covered. The root mass began to form shape. A suggestion of limbs, a curve of ribs, the rise of a jaw beneath soft moss. Something was growing from the memory. Not bone, not flesh. Something in between. She needs a name, the girl said. Clara's breath caught. I gave her mine. Elsbeth continued, voice quieter now. But I want it back. The wind returned sharp and sudden. The corn swayed in time with it moving, not with nature, but with purpose, like breath drawn in before a word. The song grew louder, more distinct. Clara looked down at the pulsing roots. A face was forming beneath them, mouth open, as if mid-sleep. A hushed breath came from within the vines. Who was she? Clara whispered. Elsbeth didn't answer. Instead, she knelt beside the growth, placed her hand over the forming chest. The roots pulsed once, twice, then stopped. Clara's mouth moved on its own. Marjorie. The word slid out of her without effort, as though it had lived in her throat all this time. A name she hadn't spoken in years. The name of the neighbor girl. The one who disappeared that summer. The one everyone said moved away. The one Clara had seen near the well before the men arrived. The girl's body stilled. The roots sank gently back into the earth. Elsbeth rose. She remembers now. The singing ceased. Completely. The clearing fell into unnatural silence. And then from the center of the corn came a new voice. Small, soft, just one note, then another, then a hum. Not Elsbeth, not Clara, but the girl below, singing her own song. The ground closed over her, calm as sleep. The stones rolled back into place on their own. Clara turned to Elsbeth, but she was gone. The scarecrow stood again where the girl had been, arms crossed now, mouth no longer smiling. At its feet, a single braid of dark hair neatly tied with corn silk. The sun pierced the canopy above, lighting the clearing in gold. The roots were gone, so was the smell. The air smelled only of corn, now dry and warm, and the song had truly stopped. Clara sat alone in the circle, eyes closed, and for the first time since moving in, she felt peace. But peace, she would learn, doesn't last, because the earth never forgets those who listen too long. Clara didn't tell anyone about the clearing. She couldn't. Some part of her understood it wasn't meant to be spoken of, not in the daylight, not in words shaped by the world outside the corn. The next morning, the field looked ordinary again. Sunlight poured across the stalks. Wind moved through them with no direction but its own. The scarecrow was gone, the clearing gone. Even the path she'd walked had been swallowed back into the rows. David returned that day. He appeared on the porch just before noon, barefoot, and dazed as if he'd walked out of a fever dream. His voice was hoarse, and his skin smelled faintly of soil. He didn't remember where he'd been. When she asked, he simply said, "I was beneath it." There was no time, just the song. Then he smiled as though that explained everything. They didn't speak of Elsbeth, or Marjorie, or the circle. The name had been given, the song returned, and the earth seemed, if not content, then at least quiet. But Clara couldn't ignore the changes. David began to rise at exactly 4:03 a.m. each morning, always without an alarm. He would walk out into the field with a cup of black coffee and stand in the same spot for 20 minutes. When he returned, his hands were cold, and he never spoke until sunrise. The power in the house flickered on the same nights the wind stopped. The fridge would hum strangely too high-pitched, like it was catching part of a signal not meant for it. Once Clara woke to find every faucet in the house dripping not with water, but with the smell of sweet, damp corn husks. There were whispers again, not songs, not voices, just breath dragging softly through the vents. And then the notes started appearing, folded sheets of yellowed paper tucked under the porch steps, inside boots behind jars in the pantry, all written in the same looping, uneven hand. Some were blank. Some held only words. She's still listening. Don't hum. The ground is remembering. Clara tried burning one. It curled but wouldn't blacken. The flame hovered flickering, but never catching. She buried it instead. But the next morning it was back, on her pillow. She visited the well once more, just to be sure. The stones were in place. The crack was gone. No sound. No scent. But something about the dirt felt looser. As if the seal wasn't a lock, only a pause. She dug a single finger beneath the edge. The soil crumbled easily. Too easily. It felt warm. Alive. That night she dreamed of Elsbeth again. But she wasn't a girl anymore. She stood tall, cloaked in corn silk, and smoke her face a blur of voices. Her mouth never moved, but the song threaded through Clara's bones like heat. And in the dream, Elsbeth whispered, "The song doesn't end, it just waits." Clara woke, gasping. The sheets tangled around her legs, the sound of humming in her ears, but fading fast, like it had been startled back into silence. The next day a storm moved in from the west. Not a violent one, just gray and full. Rain pattered gently over the roof. The corn stayed still. The wind moved elsewhere, but deep in the field near the place, the clearing had been a new sprout pushed up through the soil. Pale white, curved at the stem like a bent finger, and around it small stones arranged themselves again. The song hadn't ended, it had simply passed on to something else. The rain continued through the night, soft and steady, a blanket that muffled sound and made the walls of the house seem farther away from each other than they had before. Clara sat by the window, watching the corn vanish into the gray haze beyond the glass. David slept in the other room, or maybe he didn't. It was hard to tell anymore. He barely spoke, ate little, watched the walls like they held stories only he could see. The humming hadn't returned, not fully, but it lingered beneath things the way the light bulbs flickered in rhythm when no one moved, the way the floor creaked in perfect meter when she passed from one room to another. The land had grown quiet, but not restful. It was a quiet that waited, that watched. Clara didn't dream anymore, not like before. Now, when she closed her eyes, she heard corn rustling in a wind that didn't exist, and the footsteps of bare feet pressing into wet earth. Always walking, never stopping. She never saw Elsbeth again in those dreams, just the outline. Sometimes Marjorie, too, always standing by the well, lips parted in mid-song, never looking at Clara directly. The farm itself changed subtly. Birds no longer landed on the barn roof. Insects didn't hum in the eaves. The scarecrow never returned yet. She often saw its shadow cast across the porch floor when no light source could explain it. Once, during a walk near the edge of the property, Clara found a ribbon tied to a cornstalk. Her own ribbon. One she had lost as a child. She picked it up. Inside the knot was a single black hair, not hers. The earth was remembering her now, too. David began whispering in his sleep. Not words. Sounds. The same cadence as the old lullaby, the one that had no real tune. The one Clara could now recite backward in her head without thinking. She tried leaving once just to see. The truck still wouldn't start. The phone lines worked, but no one ever picked up. Even when she called the diner in town, she heard nothing but static. Beneath the static, faint humming. The final note came on the third day of rain, folded and pressed against the inside of her bedroom window. No handwriting this time. Only 3 small dried corn kernels and a single phrase typed neatly. The field is full. That night the storm broke. Lightning struck somewhere in the distance twice, then again. The house shivered with each strike, the lights flickering, not in fear, but in response. A pulse. A signal. When the power failed entirely, Clara didn't move. She lit no candles. She knew this part. The singing returned just before dawn, but it was different now. No longer mournful, no longer calling. It was a lullaby, yes, but with finality. A song sung to mark the end of something. Or the beginning. Clara stood in the doorway and watched the field glow faintly in the pre-light. Mist hung low over the stalks, and in the center she could see them figures, dozens, children walking slowly between the rows. Not ghosts, not shadows, something else. The memory of those the land had taken. Elspeth at their center, eyes finally closed, her lips still. She no longer needed to sing. Others would now. The corn had bloomed white overnight. Unnatural, too pale, too still. But beautiful. Clara whispered into the air, "I hear you." The humming paused, then continued, softer, like breath drawn into the lungs of something immense. She walked inside and closed the door behind her. She didn't sleep, but she did listen. And for the first time, the song didn't frighten her, because she understood. It was never about the girl. It was never about revenge. It was about memory. And some things refuse to be forgotten. The earth holds them. The corn sings them. And those who hear, they remember. Now that the field has quieted and the echoes have faded, let your breath slow. Imagine the mist settling low over the soil, cool and soft against your skin. You're far from the clearing now. The house is silent. The wind has returned to its ordinary rustle, whispering only the names of trees, not the ones we leave behind. There's something ancient in places like that. Fields that outlive the families who tend them. Songs that aren't taught but inherited, passed through generations like old furniture or forgotten recipes. Sometimes all the land wants is to be remembered. Not feared. Not even loved. Just remembered. Feel the weight leave your shoulders as the story drifts further away, like footprints in soft earth, disappearing beneath new rain. You don't need to hold on to it. Let the melody dissolve slow and low until it's nothing more than breath. Let the silence return. The house is safe now. The night has done its work. All that's left is rest. So lay still. Let your body sink deeper into where you are. And if you hear a hum in the distance, maybe it's just the wind. Or maybe it's something older watching kindly through the window. Nothing to fear, only a memory, only a song. Good night.